Violent clashes.
Sweden's gang wars.
In a series of explosions linked to a gang war.
Instead of shooting somebody in his leg, they shoot somebody in his head.
Sweden, once a global symbol of welfare, equality, and peaceful prosperity. And yet the policies of open doors and generous reception have left economic and social scars. In the aftermath of Europe's immigration crisis, Sweden embraced more asylum seekers per capita than almost any other nation. The intention was noble, the outcome complex. Economists now find that GDP per capita dropped 1.5% after the 2015 wave. Unemployment rose 1.5 percentage points, and more than half of that economic loss lingers decades later. How did a nation of consensus become a nation wrestling with crime, segregation, and political upheaval? What does it mean when compassion collides with economic reality? To answer, we must move through time. First, the long arc of Sweden's immigration history. Then, the immediate impact of 2015. Finally, the paradox of promise and fracture that defines Sweden's present. So let's begin with the historical context, tracing how Sweden transformed from one of the most homogeneous societies in Europe into one of the most diverse, and how that shift reshaped its economy and identity. Sweden's migration story did not begin in 2015. For decades, the country drew in waves of newcomers. Post-war, it welcomed Finnish, Italian, Greek, or Yugoslav migrant workers to fuel industrial growth. Immigration then was primarily economic. Foreign workers filled factory floors, built roads, and powered Volvo's assembly lines. Integration was relatively smooth because cultural and religious differences were limited. Then, starting in the late 1970s, immigration policy shifted. Sweden moved toward asylum-based migration, welcoming refugees from distant and war-torn regions. First came Iranians fleeing revolution, then Kurds escaping persecution, followed by Somalis, Eritreans, Iraqis, and later Afghans and Syrians. By the early 1990s, the collapse of Yugoslavia brought tens of thousands of Bosnian refugees. Then came the 2000s, where immigration had become an enduring feature of the national fabric, and Sweden was taking in far more asylum seekers than any other Nordic nation. Sweden's political class embraced this transformation. Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt in 2014 famously urged Swedes to open their hearts to migrants, while Social Democrats spoke of moral duty. Sweden came to see itself as the world's humanitarian conscience, a small nation with a big heart. But this confidence was based on assumptions that generous welfare could absorb newcomers, that integration would naturally follow, and that high trust would continue regardless of demographic change. Those assumptions would be tested. Then came the European migration crisis. In 2015 alone, 162,877 people sought asylum in Sweden. This was not just an uptick, it was a demographic shockwave, with a magnitude Sweden had never known. For perspective, in a single year, Sweden received more asylum applications per capita than the United States took in during the entire decade. The government's stance was rooted in history. Sweden styled itself a humanitarian superpower. Open borders were seen as proof of moral leadership in a divided world. But behind the rhetoric of solidarity, infrastructure strained. Schools scrambled to open language programs. Municipalities rushed to provide housing. Labor agencies stretched thin. By 2024, immigration still ran high at 116,000 arrivals per year. Net migration, nearly 30,000. Not as explosive as 2015, but enough to reshape demography. 1 in 5 residents of Sweden now has foreign roots. This is the backdrop against which Sweden's modern challenges play out. But numbers are only context. The true test came when asylum became settlement, when welcome became integration, To see the damage, we turn to the labor market, the engine room of any economy. Today, Sweden faces challenges that would have seemed unimaginable a generation ago. Labor market absorption became Sweden's Achilles heel. Economically, integration has proven slow and costly. While the EU average employment rate for the foreign-born hovers near 69%, Sweden's sits slightly higher at 72%. On the surface, progress, but comparison with natives reveals the chasm: 86% employment for Swedes versus 72% for foreign-born, the largest gap in the entire European Union. Humanitarian migrants, particularly refugees, face steeper barriers. The Swedish Public Employment Service found it takes more than several years for half of refugees to enter the labor market. After a decade in Sweden, male refugees achieve only about 65% employment. For women, the figure sinks closer to 50 to 60%. Even then, many remain in low-wage jobs, contributing less in taxes than they consume in benefits. Education mismatches, language hurdles, and credential gaps reinforces the cycle. Municipalities hosting the largest refugee inflows saw unemployment climb higher, not just among migrants, but also among natives. Local labor markets bent under the pressure of sudden population shifts. Wage growth slowed, public budgets stretched. Economists confirm the finding. Refugee placement areas show higher joblessness, more fraud and assault cases, and lower long-term earnings. At the national scale, macroeconomic models tell a stark story. A 1% refugee inflow can lead to an immediate GDP per capita drop of 1.5%. Employment ratios fall 1.8 percentage points, and even 2 decades on, half of that loss remains. Sweden's generosity left a fiscal dent that time has not healed. But the story is not only numbers, it is lived reality. And in lived reality, economic gaps morph into social gaps, sometimes into open conflict, which brings us to the paradox Sweden cannot escape. Here lies the contradiction. Immigration rejuvenates demography. Without it, Sweden would age faster, its pension system under heavier strain. Sweden's birth rate, like much of Europe, has fallen below replacement levels. Migrants inject youth, ambition, and diversity, but integration failures turn demographic advantage into social liability. In some districts, segregation has deepened. High unemployment, poor school performance, and low trust in institutions are common. Rinkeby, Rosengård, Husby have become symbols of parallel societies. These vulnerable areas are classified by police as no-go zones, not because they are literally inaccessible, but because they require extraordinary resources to maintain control. While some migrants thrive, working-age non-EU migrants are 4 times more likely than native-born Swedes to have only basic education. In other words, no upper secondary diploma. EU migrants are in between, but still more disadvantaged than natives. This skills gap depresses productivity and increases welfare dependency. Crime statistics fuel polarization. Studies show individuals of foreign background are overrepresented in crime suspicion records. Yet, scholars caution, this is less about ethnicity, more about socioeconomics, poverty, segregation, exclusion. Still, the perception has grown that immigration equals insecurity. In 2013, Stockholm suburbs erupted into riots. Hundreds of cars burned, dozens arrested. By 2019, Sweden recorded more grenade attacks than almost any comparable Western country. According to the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention, BRA, Sweden went from one of the lowest firearm death rates in the 1990s to the highest in the EU by 2021. Here, statistics blur with narrative. Is Sweden unsafe or simply struggling with integration? Experts disagree. But what cannot be denied is the political fallout. The political system has shifted dramatically. The Sweden Democrats, once considered far-right outsiders, surged to become the second largest party, campaigning on law and order, the erosion of trust in institutions, and the growing divide between urban centers and rural heartlands. Other mainstream parties that once avoided the immigration issue are now forced to address it, rewriting policies, and even adopting rhetoric they once condemned. Sweden has historically ranked among the world's highest in social trust. While specific statistics vary depending on the poll, multiple reports and statements confirm a widespread belief among Swedes that integration efforts have largely failed. Former Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson stated in 2022 that Sweden had allowed parallel societies to form due to poor integration, a sentiment echoed by the emergence of a political party focused on these issues. The cumulative effect is visible. Sweden remains prosperous, but the costs of absorption, fiscal, social, and cultural, are eroding confidence in its model. What does it mean to be Swedish in an era of diversity? What binds a society when language, culture, and economic outcomes diverge? Thus, Sweden's paradox, a humanitarian triumph in principle, a fragile equilibrium in practice. The same policies that once signaled moral leadership now weigh on budgets, schools, and police stations. And so we arrive at the final question, one that hovers over Sweden's future. Can a nation built on ideals reconcile them with reality? Sweden stands at a crossroads, not only of policy, but of identity. Sweden once stood as proof that wealth and compassion could coexist, that a generous welfare state could welcome the world without breaking. But today, the results are mixed. Economic scars persist, unemployment that persists, crime statistics fuel fear and cohesion that frays. And yet, schools are filled with children of immigrants who speak fluent Swedish, dream in Swedish, and see no homeland but Sweden itself. The future hinges on these children. If integration succeeds, Sweden may emerge stronger, more resilient, its diversity an engine rather than a fracture. If integration fails, disillusionment may harden into permanent divides, with enclaves of exclusion besides islands of prosperity. The moral dimension lingers as well. Sweden built its modern reputation on compassion, on being the humanitarian superpower. To retreat now would be to betray that legacy. But to press on without reform risks stretching the welfare state past breaking. The refugee crisis did not destroy Sweden, but it changed it, irreversibly. Can Sweden repair the fractures without abandoning its ideals? Or will it be forced to choose between openness and order, between the nation it aspired to be and the nation it has become? What remains of Sweden's promise?